Welcome to the Eastmans Predator Pros podcast. I'm your host, Geoff. Great to have you along on this particular episode, the second one of the series. Great to be back on here. This one, we're going to talk a lot more about coyote tactics. The season is in full swing now for myself. Just had our first hunt of the season a couple days ago. So throughout this episode, I'm going to talk about that hunt. I'm going to talk about all kinds of early season tactics as well, and all the things that go into the planning process in the early season. So getting into this episode, I want to talk about early season tactics. And before I even get going, you may be thinking, seasons on coyotes? Yeah, in most states there isn't a technical season on coyotes. You can shoot coyotes year round. For me personally, it's a self-imposed season. And it goes back a little bit to what I do and what I do for a real job, I guess you could say. It goes back to the fact that, the coyotes here in western Nebraska, where I primarily hunt, have always been worth some money in the fur market. So, if you look at, my real job, I own a lawn care company, and, so I'm busy with that from March through October-ish. I also am pretty heavy into baseball. I coach a travel baseball team with my middle son, Carver. I'm the president of our youth baseball organization here in Scottsbluff, where I live. So extremely busy in the summer, so there's just not a lot of time for me to do anything other than those things. On top of that, I'm not a big fan of being out in the heat and the grass and, dealing with the bugs and snakes and stuff like that in the summertime to shoot coyotes. So that's really why I have a self-imposed season. Part of me, is wants to give the coyotes a break, I guess. When you hunt them as hard as I do for 5 months and you kill, 300 or whatever it might be, you're kind of like, okay, I went hard. It's time to change it up. And I really like the change of that. Not to say that if you're hunting them year round, that's a bad thing. It's just not for me. And then on the fur market side, which we'll talk about here, in regards to early season tactics, we're going to look at the life cycle of coyotes throughout a year. We're only getting one crop of coyotes a year, and there's a thought process out there that, if you're out there shooting the coyotes off on your places in the summer, then there's just maybe not going to be as many coyotes out there in those same places come fall. And there's a lot of factors involved in that, I think, that we're going to talk about. But I've kind of been under that assumption as well that, why really go kill a bunch of them in the summer when they're not worth anything, when I can wait until the fall, when their fur is primed up a little bit, and then I can get a little bit of money out of them as well. So plus it's colder, hiking around and stuff, you're not sweating as bad, and just gets me pumped up to go hunt coyotes when it's a little cooler, not 95 degrees and sunny. But on the same hand, the thermal game is changing the scenery quite a bit, with more and more guys getting a hold of thermal, more and more states opening up regulations so you can thermal hunt, night hunt. I know a lot of guys will do that in the summer. Obviously, it cools down in the evening times in the summer, so that opens up some options as well. But when I say seasons, keep in mind, most of the time there's not an actual coyote season. When I refer to a season, it's my personal self-imposed season. So before we get into some real tips and tactics, I want to kind of run you through this first hunt of the season. It was a fun one. Happened a couple days ago. It's middle of October. That's usually about the earliest I'll get going every year. Like I said, mostly because of my lawn care business and things like that. But anyway, my boys are super pumped. They're always excited this time of year. They get the itch. I'm getting the itch. I start to see, pictures on social media from guys, that are out killing a few coyotes, and that doesn't help the itch at all. But anyway, so we decided to pack up and head down to Colorado to hunt with a good buddy of mine, Brett Rye. I've known Brett for a long time. Actually met Brett through my contest that I put on up here in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, the Coyote Craze Classic. Brett's hunted in that a lot of years, and he actually started hunting in the contest probably back in 2010. And at the time, I was filming the Coyote Craze DVD series, and after the contest was over, we got to talking, and he invited me to come down and do some filming with him. So that's how we first met. Since then, we've been partners in contests. We hunt the Wyoming Best of the Best state championship contest. We're actually defending champs, and we've won it 2 out of the last 3 years. So we're looking to defend our title coming up here in November for that again. But anyway, he has a son named Elliot who's 6. Last year we took Elliot out, and he actually was able to kill his first coyote, so that was pretty exciting. So he said Elliot was getting excited, and I ended up taking my 2 older boys, Creighton and Carver, along with us. So we loaded up, headed down to Colorado. Like I mentioned earlier, I have a prototype of the Super Revolt, and they're not quite out yet. The production models aren't in stock yet. That's all in process right now. But Rick had this prototype, and Rick's actually up in Kodiak right now trying to call in a brown bear. So he knew he wasn't going to be using this call for a month or so. So he sent it to me, and I was excited to go test it out. Like I mentioned earlier in the intro, the Super Revolt has every feature that the Revolt has, which was my go-to call, was the Revolt. But there's some things that we wanted to upgrade on the Revolt for people that really were looking for the ultimate predator call, by beefing this call up a little bit, using the same remote that's on the Roughneck, and then the ability to play 2 sounds at once was really the new feature of this call that I was excited to try out. So we loaded up, headed down to Colorado. It's always a long day. People, I think, underestimate what I'll do to shoot coyotes. Essentially, we got up at 4 in the morning. We left Scottsbluff, about 4:20, and it was about an hour and 45 minutes down to Sterling to meet up with Brett. And then we hunt all day, and then we drive home that night. It was 9:30 when we rolled into the house, and it was a Sunday. I know my wife Gina wasn't real happy that the boys were pretty tuckered and they had school the next day, but that's a typical day of coyote hunting for me. It's not unusual for me to drive 2 hours one way to hunt coyotes just for the day and drive back. So, keep that in mind. I talk to a lot of guys that feel like, if they're driving more than 30 minutes, that's all the farther they want to go to find coyotes. Sometimes you got to drive. Sometimes you got to get away from things. So it's not unusual. That's pretty common for me to drive hour and a half, 2 hours one way. But, this hunt was no different. But anyway, we get down there. We knew the weather was going to be typical for early season. It was going to be down in the, mid-40s at sunup throughout the day. The wind was going to, maybe blow 10 or 20. And it was supposed to get up to 70, 72 degrees, which is very typical. And knowing that, that when the weather conditions get like that, some may call it kind of a bluebird kind of day, that, the coyotes aren't going to be real motivated. And I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail in a little bit. When it comes to hunting these early season conditions, and what to expect. But anyway, we get down there and get going. Early season like this, and I'm going to go into this in a little bit detail too. We lay out a plan. Brett and I, have some text conversations throughout the week about, where we're going to go, and he's lining up permission with certain landowners, and he's like, we got some public areas down here as well. I think, be worth hitting those. So he kind of lays us out a plan of how we want to go based off of the wind direction, a route that's going to take us to all these places throughout the day, or we're not having to do a lot of backtracking and waste a lot of time. And we elect to start off on some public stuff, some public walk-in right off the bat. And just big open pasture country, kind of some tall grass and some sagebrush, some kind of rolling sandhill kind of looking stuff. So, we get into that first stand. In early season, I'm expecting, which I'll talk about this in a little more detail, too, the coyote dynamic that time of year. What percentage of coyotes are pups, what percentage of coyotes are older coyotes, things like that. That's all things that go into my calculations when it comes to picking the different sounds and things. So I elect to, start off with less aggressive, and I'll get into more of this detail as well, but less aggressive prey-based sounds. Squeaky sounds, lip squeaks, a sound called baby cottontail demise, swamp rat, some real less aggressive sounds. When I say less aggressive prey sounds, that would be those. When I say more aggressive, would be kind of your loud, growly jackrabbit sounds and things like that. And this all falls into the whole coyote dynamic, which I'll go into a little bit. But first stand goes by, we don't see any coyotes. We move into the second stand. And the great thing about having my boys, one thing I've noticed, I'm 42 years old, so I'm not young, but I'm not old either. My eyes aren't near what they are. I haven't got to the point where I need glasses or contacts or anything yet, but in low light conditions, my eyes just sometimes don't pick up coyotes like, my spry young boys can. And it's great to have them on stand with me because I call them my little coyote spotters sometime, because they'll spot coyotes. A lot of times I find myself anymore, I really don't, when I'm scanning on a stand, I don't look past maybe 200 or 300 yards. And that's on stands, obviously, when you can see quite a ways. My boys, they'll look out there as far as they can see, and a lot of times, especially Carver, my middle boy, and it must be why he's pretty decent at baseball. He has really good eyesight, he spots these coyotes out there at 600-700 yards coming, and he'll freak out. And you'd think the coyote was right at the call the way he's acting, but then he'll say, way out there, and I'm looking, and I can't see the dang thing, and he's mad at me because I can't see it, and I'm just telling him to be a little patient. The coyote's still coming. I'm telling him just to keep me informed on what the coyote's doing. But either way, actually my oldest boy, we get to the second stand of them. We don't see anything on the first stand, so we move up the road a little bit, about a mile and a half, and we walk into another spot. Brett, had a spot where we could pull off the road. The vehicle's hidden behind a little hill, and we could skirt around it. And it was a little bit longer walk. That's the downside sometimes to hunting some of this public walk-in stuff is your walks in and out are a little bit longer than normal, but you kind of base those decisions. Hey, is it worth, where we can get to, is it worth the walk and worth, wasting that extra time walking in and out? And these stands, obviously, we felt it was. So we get in there. I started off with a sound on that Lucky Duck called lip squeaks. And if it's pretty calm conditions, I'll crank that up to maybe 24, 26 on the call, which is almost full volume. And you'd be surprised, that sound carries out there quite a bit. It's not a great sound to use when it's real windy just because it doesn't cut the wind that great. But on this particular stand, I started off using that. And a lot of times when we're hunting anymore, we use two-way radios with earpieces, and we spread out, and we cover. On this particular stand, Brett and Creighton were way down around the side hill, kind of covering the downwind half of the stand, and Carver and I were set up covering the call. And I'd walked the call way out there, about 50, 60 yards from us, and we kind of worked our way up on this little side slope just where we could have a little bit better visibility because, the early season hunting, a lot of times you'll run into the vegetation issues. The grass is still tall. The wind and cold and snow hasn't knocked some of that stuff down. So sometimes it's hard to see coyotes coming through that stuff. You got to figure a coyote at the shoulder's only, maybe 2 foot tall. The top of his ears are maybe, 28 inches, 30 inches tops. And it doesn't take a whole lot of grass for a coyote to blend in. So if you can get a little bit of elevation, you can see down into that a little bit better and hopefully catch that movement. And that's what we did. And either way, my Creighton was actually on the downwind side, and there was a 2-track road cutting through that pasture, and he actually said, hey, there's a coyote that's right in the middle of the 2-track on a hill out there about 500 yards. So, and he's relaying information to me, and he told me that the coyote was sitting down just looking at us. Well, at that point, you have several options. I mean, you can continue to use the same sound, but at that point, if that coyote's sitting down while that sound's playing, he lost interest to that sound. So at that point, I'll switch up. So I switched up to a sound called Lucky Pecker. And sure enough, I still don't see the coyote, but Creighton comes over the radio and says, hey, the coyote's up, and he's trotting our way. So at that point, it's just a matter of being a little patient and kind of waiting to see where this coyote shows up. Well, a minute or two goes by, and sure enough, Carver now spots the coyote as he comes up out of this little draw, and the coyote starts to circle us. And at this point, this time of year, you can assume that it's, could be an older coyote that's maybe just a little more cautious, or it could be a pup coyote that's just is still unsure of itself, really, maybe wanting to come in to investigate, but, just doesn't quite know what's going on. And that ended up being the case. This was actually a pup coyote. It was an older pup coyote. It had its full adult teeth in. It was probably a 22, 24-pound coyote. But it gets to about 150 yards, and it starts paralleling us. Now, at this point, the wind's clear back behind us. I know Brett and Carver are covering that. This coyote has a long, long ways to go before it's going to get our wind. So, but when the coyote starts paralleling you, it's the gig's about up. That's probably all the closer he's going to get. So at this point, I'm just talking Carver through it and telling him, hey, okay, let's be patient. Let's just wait till the coyote gives us a good shot. And the grass was tall enough you could really only see the top of the back, the very, very top of the coyote's back and his head and neck cutting through the sagebrush and grass. So I had Carver move his gun and kind of get ahead of where the coyote was going. And when it kind of got into this little clearing, he was down on the gun, ready to go. We gave a quick woof, and the coyote stopped up about 160 yards, and all he had was a head and neck shot, and he put a great shot on it. Hit it right underneath the chin, just dropped it dead in his tracks. He was pretty pumped up. That was obviously his first coyote of the year. And that was the first coyote of our hunting season, so hard to beat that. But we loaded up, hiked that coyote back to the truck. We went down the road a little bit, kind of came in and made the same exact setup, ended up killing another coyote. Kind of the same situation. We started calling. This coyote came in from hard right, and it was early on too, and I was just using the lip squeak sounds, probably within the first 3 minutes, and off from the right, this coyote comes hard over the hill, and there was a little bowl in front of us, and another hill out there in front of us, probably, 70 or 80 yards, and I'd actually walked that call out to that side of that ridge, that hill, and the goal was if a coyote comes from straight out, he would, disappear between the middle hill, and he would pop up, right at the call, and we'd kill him, or if he hung up on the far hill, it was only like a 200-yard shot, or if the coyote came in from hard right or hard left, it would funnel that coyote right down that ridge to the call and not on the side of the hill where we were sitting. And sure enough, it worked out perfect. The coyote came in from the right. He was locked into the call. And at that point, if I can get him to stop with using the call, that's what you want, because the coyotes, that's the whole point. One of the whole points of using the e-call with the remote and getting the call out away from you is so that the coyote's focus is on the call, not you sitting off to the side. As soon as you go woo or bark or yell at the coyote, you just gave away your position. So if I do everything I can to stop the coyote using the call, whether I hit a preset and it's a coyote female challenge scream howl or something on there to try to get that coyote to stop before I resort to trying to bark. Well, anyway, this coyote was on a pretty good run coming down to the call, and the grass was once again tall, and I hit the preset, but the coyote wasn't stopping, so we start woofing, trying to get the coyote, and it checks up and looks right up at us, and it stopped for just a few seconds, which wasn't long enough for any of the boys to get a shot at it, and it spun around and took off running. And at that point, you can if you see enough coyotes come to the call, you can realize that this coyote just wasn't going to stop and give us a look back. He had been in close enough. He saw us, and he was getting the heck out of there. So I was able to get down on the gun and rolled him up, probably a 100-yard shot running off. So I felt good about that because I'm not going to lie to you, over the course of the spring and summer, I don't ever have a chance to go shooting. So I hadn't even shot my gun up until a week ago. I just went out to the range and got everything sighted in and ready to go. So I hadn't even shot at a coyote since March. And the first coyote I get to shoot at was a running coyote, and I killed him on the first one. So that made me excited. And it's with running shots. I get a lot of questions on that. And to me, it's just a habit. It's like a second nature at this point. That's why I can, it just seems like there's really no way to practice it other than just shooting at running coyotes. And it's something that just stays with you. But I got a few other stories throughout the day that happened with that as well. But, now we're 2 stands in a row. We got 2 coyotes. This coyote was a younger coyote and had some mange on it. So he was obviously a good one to thin out early in the season like this. So we ended up going to the next spot up the highway a little bit. And it's the last stand that we're going to have on this particular chunk of public walk-in area. And we walk into the stand, and it was probably a half-mile walk-in. The boys were dragging. They were complaining. They're fortunate, a lot of times when we're hunting sandhill country and things like that, we're able to get in pretty close to our stands because we're just basically using my truck and off-roading it through these big, massive pastures and pulling in behind a little hill. And usually the walks aren't more than, maybe 100 yards into a stand is all. So these, 600-700-yard walks into these stands on this public stuff were a little more than the boys were used to, but it was good to see them work a little bit. But we get into this stand, and the wind's not quite ideal. It's kind of a crosswind, but the wind is actually a little more behind us. And what I mean by that is when we get into this stand, you're really wanting, 180 degrees out in front of you of where you're hoping the coyotes to come from. And in that 180 degrees, you don't want to walk through that, which we didn't have to. We walked from the other 180 behind us. The truck's parked back in that back 180. And you don't want your scent blowing there. Well, when we got there, the scent was kind of blowing from right to left and out into that 180 just a little bit. It was just a little bit past, being a crosswind. So knowing that, I thought, the way we wanted to set up, our scent was just going to be blowing down a draw that I thought a coyote could probably easily come from. So we ended up backing out a little bit and working our way downwind until we found a hillside that we could see more downwind better, and that we were all lined up better with our wind blowing. And in those setups like that where the wind's a little questionable, a lot of times I'll walk the call farther out just to create that imaginary scent trail. And I talk about this a lot, and I'll talk about it a lot throughout these podcasts. When a coyote's hunting the sound, he's hunting the imaginary scent trail that's coming from that e-call. There's not you and I sitting on the side hill, we have a constant scent coming off of us, and it's a scent trail that meanders its way across the landscape however the wind blows it. There's not a constant scent coming off the call. Yes, there is scent associated with it, and yes, if a coyote gets, within 10 yards of it, he may be able to smell it at that point, but he's not going to smell the call 100 yards downwind of it or even 50 yards downwind of it because it's not that constant scent. So that's really the illusion we're creating by putting the e-call out there, is that now the coyote's hunting that, and, picture our scent trail blowing from right to left, and I run the e-call out 70 yards in front of us, and basically there's a 90-degree angle. If I draw a line from me to the e-call, and then I draw a line which direction the wind's blowing from me to where my scent's blowing, that creates kind of a 90-degree angle. Now, if I draw a line from the e-call in the direction the wind's blowing, that would be this imaginary scent trail. Now, that imaginary scent trail line is essentially paralleling our real scent trail, which is now about 70 yards apart. So when a coyote circles downwind, he really doesn't have any reason to cross that imaginary scent trail and continuing even more that way to reach our real scent trail. And that's essentially what we did on this setup. And I had Creighton cover, the far downwind, and Brett and myself and the boys were right at the call. Well, anyway, as soon as I start the call, at this point I'm kind of going, it's kind of like fishing in some cases. If it's working, it's working. The last couple coyotes we called in had basically been on lip squeaks. So that's what I started the standoff with. The wind hadn't picked up yet, so I knew that sound would still carry plenty far. And so I get going, fire the call up, and it's just less than a minute in. Creighton comes over the radio and says, "Hey, there's a coyote off to my left, almost straight downwind, that just stood up on the grass." So this coyote was just laid up sleeping right there. And once it heard the sound, it stood up, and he said it started making its way. And so I reminded him over the radio that, hey, just really be sure of exactly where your wind's going, and just don't get too greedy. If once you get a shot under a couple 100 yards here, let's try to kill this coyote. And Creighton did a great job. There was a couple minutes of silence, and all of a sudden you hear whack, and I knew the coyote was pretty close because you could hear the whack just instantaneously after the shot. Well, anyway, this coyote worked his way right down in front of him, and it was honed into the sound. Had no clue Creighton was even sitting there. He did a great job of not moving. And once the coyote moved, I've taught these boys sometimes, instead of woofing at coyotes, just if they don't know you're there, actually just move a little bit. And that's exactly what Creighton did. He just actually shook his body a little bit, and the coyote saw that out of its peripheral vision and checked up and looked at him. Well, he was already on it and dropped it right there, Sometimes, you can woof, and sometimes your adrenaline's pumped up, and it comes out a little louder than maybe what you wanted it to. And obviously that can cause coyotes to freak out, maybe look up at you real quick and see you. Sometimes I resort to a lip squeak over a woof sometimes to get them to stop as well. It doesn't seem to maybe freak them out as much. But anyway, 3 stands in a row, 3 coyotes, and I'm thinking, wow, this is going to turn out to be a pretty good day. At that point, we packed up out of there. Brett had some stands, had some landowners, about 15 minutes away that we headed to and put together a plan. And at this point in the day, it's like 9:30, and we had 3 in the truck. And, we hunt. Now it's up to 70 degrees. We eat some sandwiches. The boys are kind of periodically skipping stands and taking naps in the truck. And before we know it, it's 2:30, and we haven't even seen a coyote since that third coyote we killed, which is very typical. I mean, it's nice weather. Early season like this, there's lots of food sources, which I'm going to talk about here in a little bit. So it's just a matter of getting in close enough to these coyotes. I'm not expecting early season coyotes in bluebird weather to come running from a mile away, especially in these conditions and in this part of the world. So, but it's just a matter of grinding out stands, covering ground, and trying to find coyotes. So we probably knocked out 10 or 12 stands there throughout that middle 5 hours or more without even seeing a coyote. And, we got into some agriculture ground. In that country, there's some dryland corn. There's a lot of wheat ground, wheat stubble, things like that. And there was some access to some properties that Brett had some standing corn still on it. They haven't harvested yet. Once that corn's harvested, those stands aren't really stands at all, because then once that corn's gone, there's really no cover in there at all. There's nowhere to hide a vehicle. There's nowhere to do anything, once later in the winter gets here. So we elected to make a couple of these stands because this is really the only time of year you're going to be able to make those stands, because the corn is still in. And obviously corn's a great cover, any kind of crop like that. Those coyotes are going to lay up in there. They're going to spend time in there. But there's food sources in there for them. So it's a great place. So we finally get to a stand where, and I'm going to back up a little bit. I forgot, Brett is a rural route UPS driver. So, it's a unique job that he has that's basically helped him in the coyote hunting game, because he's delivering packages to ranchers and farmers all day long. And he's done this for 100 years down there, it seems like. So that's basically how he's met all these farmers and ranchers and how he's got access. And then on top of that, he's driving these roads every day delivering packages. So he's seeing coyotes. He's kind of, locking it in to say, hey, I saw a coyote over in this place, 2 times last week. So we would talk about that and where he's been seeing coyotes and using all that intel that we can to figure out, where we're going to make these setups. Well, we get to a spot where he said he'd been seeing a coyote in the area, and there was a ditch, irrigation ditch that kind of ran through the section of ground there. Some, heavy, tall CRP grass on one side. There was some wheat stubble. So we set up along this ditch. And I actually walk down in the ditch and up on the other bank and out into the wheat stubble and put the call. And my thought on that was, we didn't have a whole lot of visibility if a coyote would come along the ditch, and there was a lot of tall weeds along the ditch as well. So my idea was, if a coyote comes from the other side of the ditch, we'll be fine, because he's got to cross the wheat stubble and we'll be able to see him. But if a coyote comes from left to right down this ditch, it might be tricky to see this coyote before we can get him killed. And by putting it out there, maybe he would come up on the inside part of the bank to get a visual of the call, and that would give us a shot. Well, once again, I'd been sticking with the lip squeaks. I knew it worked earlier in the day. It was just a matter of getting close enough to some coyotes that wanted to respond to it. And just a few minutes in to playing these lip squeaks, I look clear to our right down the ditch about, 200 yards, there's a bend, and that was the only part of the bottom of the ditch that I could see, and here's this coyote running right down the bottom of the ditch coming to the call. And at that point, I lost him. I got on the radio and told Brett that, hey, we had one coming right down the ditch, and he was set up to the left, and he actually had a better view straight down the ditch. So he watched this coyote come right up, and I was sitting with Carver, and I had Carver ready, as soon as this coyote came up on the ditch bank, that we'd be able to shoot him, but we never did see him. And, all of a sudden we hear Brett, whack, and he actually killed the coyote. The coyote had actually got to the ditch where I had walked down through it. And anytime a coyote gets to where you have walked, they're probably going to smell it. Luckily, this was a little dinky pup, and he didn't know any better. And once he cut my tracks and winded that, he actually kept on running straight down the ditch. A lot of times they'll flip around and do a 180 and run right back out where they came from. But this coyote decided to turn and just keep on running the way it was headed, which was right at Brett, and he ended up shooting him running down the bottom of the ditch. But it was a little dinky coyote, probably a run of the litter, maybe a late litter. I mean, this coyote probably didn't weigh more than 12 or 14 pounds. as Brett said, it was harder to hit because it was such a small target. But it was a light drag back to the truck. But we felt good now because, hey, we're finally on coyotes again. 4th coyote of the day. It's about 3:30. Great thing about early season, the sun wasn't set until 6:30, so we still had 2.5 hours of hunting left. So we get back to an area where we have some standing corn, and we have some cattle in a pasture, and it's another little public walk-in section. Just lots of cover. If you look out there in 180 degrees, there's multiple places where coyotes could be. There's several big, thick tree rows. There's this entire corn circle. So the more when you set up on a stand like that, and you take that 180 degrees of untouched area out in front of you, the more places that there could be coyotes out in that 180 degrees, the better. And this had lots of options where coyotes could come from. So obviously it was a primo stand that we wanted to make. So I get on the call. This one took a little bit longer. Early season like this, I'm going to stick to probably 2 primary sound base. I'm going to start with a prey distress sound of some kind, usually on the less aggressive side. If it gets windy, then I may move to more of a louder rabbit sound just because it is naturally louder and it's going to cut the wind a little bit better and carry farther. But then that second half of the stand, I'm going to go to some pup distress sounds. And we're going to talk about that, why I do that here in a little bit when we talk about the coyote life cycle and the dynamic of coyotes that time of year. But that's actually when this coyote showed up. I was into some pup distress, and I believe it was a schoolyard brawl, I believe was the sound on the Lucky Duck. And this coyote actually, I don't know if he came from down the tree row or if he was in the cornfield, but we catch him off to the left, and he's streaking down the edge of the cornfield. He's not wanting to come to the call, but he's wanting to try to get to a point where he can see the call. And there were 2 or 3 different gaps in the tree row, and Creighton and Carver were off to my left, and as the coyote's coming down, they see him, and so their instincts took over, so they look ahead of where the coyote's heading, and they see these couple gaps, and they get set up. Well, the coyote runs into the gap, and, Creighton lets out a woof to try to stop him. Well, he stops. Well, I have a shot. I'm further off to the right. I have a head and neck shot at about 160 yards. Creighton was up a little higher on the hill, so I figured he would have a full body shot at the coyote. But the coyote stopped a little too far left in the gap, and he stopped right behind a tree branch, and Creighton didn't have a shot. And I was holding up thinking Creighton was going to shoot him. And the coyote stopped for maybe about 4 or 5 seconds, and then it turned and trotted into the cornfield. So at that point, I knew the coyote hadn't winded us. I really doubted it could even see us up there. We were tucked into a fence line that had quite a bit of weeds and stuff, so I really didn't think he picked us out. So whenever that happens, a lot of times I'll just start switching through multiple pup distresses, playing for each maybe 30 seconds to a minute, because a lot of times those coyotes don't leave. They're just hanging out back in that cover somewhere, and they'll come back. You'll catch their interest one more time, and they'll come back and give you a look. And about a minute and a half later, I had flipped through a couple different pup distresses. I think maybe Sig Kicking Ass number 3, maybe Pup Chaos. I can't remember exactly, but running down the same route is another coyote. Whether it was the same coyote or a different coyote, I don't know yet. I guess I'll never really know. But it came on the same exact path. It ran the same exact speed, and it stopped in the same exact gap, almost in the exact same spot. But this time I knew that Creighton didn't have a shot, and when he checked up, I had a head and neck shot at about 160 and put one right underneath his chin, and that was that. But pretty exciting. I mean, it's a different experience. Sometimes what you'll get, it's not all, early season is not all just young, dumb pups come running in. There's still older coyotes out there. And this coyote ended up being probably a 2-year-old male coyote, that we got out of that stand. But, at that point, we're 5 coyotes deep. The sun's starting to, get a little lower in the sky. It's cooling down a little bit. The wind's actually dying down for us, which is always great. And I talked to Brett, and I said, it seems like, we were finding more coyotes earlier today in more just rolling pasture country, not more of this ag-based ground. So he said, you know what, I got a place we can go that's got, I got enough for about 2 stands. It's a couple different sections, and it's just rolling pasture with, grass and sagebrush and things like that. So one of the stands was a little thicker grass and things like that than the other one. So I said, you know what? Let's make the stand that has the thickest cover, let's make it first before it gets too dark, because obviously the taller the grass, the thicker the grass, it's harder to spot those coyotes once the sun goes down and it starts getting dark. So we elected to make that one first. So Brett and his son Elliot and Carver and I went on kind of the left side of the hill, and Creighton decided he wanted to be the downwind guy. So I sent him about 150 yards kind of down the side hill on the downwind side, and he was covering basically a whole part of the stand that we couldn't even see. And it's not just a few minutes in, and all of a sudden, at this point, I'm trying some new radios, and the batteries died on our radios at this point. So we had no radios. And all of a sudden I hear Creighton over there woofing, like, woo, woo. So instantly, he has a coyote. He's trying to get this coyote to stop. And I'm waiting to hear a pew, but nothing. And about that time, Brett lip squeaks at me and points straight out in motions that we have another coyote coming from straight out. And I'm still waiting for a shot from Creighton. I don't hear anything. So I switch it up to a different pup distress, because I was playing a prey distress sound at that point. I switched it up one of the pup distress, I think Sig kicking ass, and still don't hear anything. And at this point now, a couple minutes have gone by. So I'm just assuming that, well, that coyote that Creighton saw must have winded him or something. And about that time, I hear a whack coming from Creighton. Well, at the same time, I look down, and Brett says, right down here. Well, the coyote he had seen had got into about 200 yards right below us in the grass, and I just couldn't see the coyote. I talked earlier about my eyes getting bad when it gets low light. I just didn't see this coyote, and all of a sudden, this coyote takes off running kind of at a 45-degree angle away because of the shot that Creighton, and I get the coyote in the scope, and just from watching lots and lots of coyotes run off, you can just tell that this coyote is not going to stop. So I kind of bear down. At this point now, the coyote's probably, 230, 240 on probably a 2/3 run. He's getting out of there. So I felt pretty good about it. So I squared up on him. First shot, missed him. Obviously, he takes off running full speed at this point. It was probably, he was probably 275 running at probably a 45 away from us. I put the crosshairs out there probably 10 feet. It's hard to say sometimes. It's hard for me to remember exactly. It's more instinct than anything. But, 10 feet in front of that coyote, squeezed off the second round, and that coyote just rolled up, dead in the grass. Carver shot at the same time that I shot my second shot when the coyote rolled. So he thought he had shot the coyote. And I'll be honest with you, if we were goose hunting and, that happens, I would have probably given him the goose. But obviously a running coyote, so I have to ask him. I said, how far did you lead that coyote, Carver? And he said 3 feet. And I said, no, you didn't hit that coyote then. That wasn't far enough, So anyway, now I'm excited to hear what happened to Creighton. So the sun's setting now, so we're scrambling, as contest hunters, and just the way we hunt in general, we're hustling now because we want to try to get in one more stand. We're pumped up because we just killed a double. It's our 6th and 7th coyote of the day. We're pumped up, so we're hustling now. So Brett and the boys head back to get the truck. I head down to try to find this coyote in the tall grass. I find the coyote. I drag him over. They drive down the road, pick me up. Creighton's all pumped up about his story. I guess what happened is his coyote came in almost straight downwind of him, was running at the call. Creighton was woofing out. The coyote was looking at him on a full run coming to the call and peeled out of there, and Creighton lost him down in the sagebrush. But the coyote didn't. When I switched up to that pup, the coyote must have looped back or something, because then Creighton said the coyote disappeared for a minute or so and then showed back up right downwind of him again and ran over the hill behind him. And Creighton's must have been paying attention the last few years, because a lot of times if a coyote runs over the hill behind you, we'll jump up and take off running up over the hill, because the coyote's gone at that point. Unless you jump up and run up to the top of the hill and try to get a shot at him running off behind you. And that's what Creighton did. He said he ran up to the top of the hill. He said at that point the coyote was like 40 yards running off, kind of looking back over his shoulder at him, and he said he offhanded him. Ended up shooting him right in the face. It was kind of interesting. He talked more about, I'd never seen this before, but he was actually shooting my dad's bolt action 22-250. And he shot the coyote right in the face. And he said it actually blew the tongue off of the coyote, which is the weirdest thing I've ever seen. He said the coyote was laying dead, and the tongue of the coyote was like 5 feet laying in the sand beside it, which is unreal. But he was so proud of that, that he had made that shot, which was pretty cool. That was exciting for me to hear that he had the wherewithal to run up and do that, So anyway, we throw the coyotes in the truck, and just as we had planned, we got one last stand. We had to actually backtrack around on a county road and pull in there. And same thing, we kind of had a fence line. And at this point, sometimes on a late stands like this with grass, I will take my thermal and use it as a scanner just to help spot coyotes coming in. Even though we're going to shoot them with our normal day scopes, I'll just scan with my thermal. So Creighton wanted to take the thermal to scan since he had just killed a coyote. That was his second coyote of the day, so I don't think he was thinking he was going to get a coyote anyway. So he went to the left, him and Brett and Elliot, and he was scanning with the thermal. Carver and I went off to the right, and on the right side of the fence, they must have had more cattle in that pasture over the summer because the grass wasn't near as tall. It was mowed down quite a bit. It was a lot easier to see, and that's honestly why I elected to pick it, because I knew getting dark like that, it was going to be hard to see these coyotes, and the more, the less grass was in that pasture, the better off it'd be. So we get set up, and once again, I start with some lip squeaks, and it's not just several minutes in, and Carver says, "Dad, off to the right," and I look, and they're coming in this little bottom of this draw is this coyote, and once again, I had the call out in front of us, kind of to funnel any coyotes that got down in this low spot. They would funnel them from right to left, right in front of us to the call, and it was off to the side a little bit as well. So this coyote's working his way right up the bottom on a pretty decent trot coming to the call, and Carver asked if he could shoot him. Well, I was pointed right where that coyote was coming from. Carver was kind of pointed more straight out front, and I said, yeah, Carver, if you can get on him. Well, as Carver was moving to get on the coyote, obviously the coyote saw that little bit of movement, didn't know what we were because we were tucked into some sagebrush and things, and the coyote checked up just perfect for him. He was able to get on it, and he shot that coyote chest on about 75 yards. So that was his second coyote of the day, and he was pretty pumped up. And at that point, throughout the day, I had been messing with the two sounds at once, and maybe playing a rabbit sound and a pup distress sound at the same time, and then occasionally pausing the rabbit sound and just maybe letting out a few wah, 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 and then pausing while the whole time the pup distress is going, just to create some different sounds, some different scenarios. And that's what I did. I was playing some Sig Kickin' Ass and some Cotton Ball. And now, maybe 3-4 minutes have went by since we killed that coyote. We've probably been on stand a total of 8 minutes at this point. And Carver whispers over him and says, "Dad, there's two of them standing up on the skyline." And so I look up at the skyline, and I can't see anything. And he says, "They're just standing there, Dad." And I still can't see these coyotes. So a lot of times if a coyote checks up like that, within a couple hundred yards, a lot of times I'll switch to one of those squeaky sounds like baby cottontail demise or lip squeaks. I kind of call it a finisher sound, and that's what I did. I reached down and and I have lip squeaks on a preset, so I just reached down and hit the preset, and it killed both of those two sounds I had going, and it went to lip squeaks. And Carver doesn't say anything to me, so I'm still looking up on the skyline, trying to see where these coyotes are, and I kind of move my head to look back at Carver, and his eyes are getting big, and he says, "They're right here, Ned." Well, these coyotes that came, once the lip squeaks hit, they had come running down off the hill, and they were running in the same bottom that first coyote was, and they actually ran right past this dead coyote. A lot of times they'll smell it and check up and do some weird things, but they actually ran right past the first dead coyote, and they got into about 50 yards, and they kind of looked up, and they could kind of see us up there, and they kind of start peeling off a little bit, and they slow down, but they're kind of bouncing on a trot. And this is where it gets hairy sometimes. They don't always want to stop for you when they get that close, and they're bouncing, and it's not always an easy shot. Well, Carver shoots first and actually hits the coyote on the left. Doesn't make a great shot on it, but it's an anchoring shot. Well, the coyote on the right turns and starts racing up the side hill to the right, and I was able to get on this coyote. He was maybe about 70 yards streaking up the hill, and I had one shot at him before he got up, and I ended up rolling him right as he was clearing the top of the hill. By that point, Carver had shot his coyote another time to finish it off, and it was pretty exciting. killing a triple on the last stand. Carver was pumped up. Poor Brett and Creighton were over. They didn't see any of this happen, but yet they had to come over and help us drag coyotes back to the truck. So it was a great, fun way to start the season. Getting kids out there. Early season tactics, when you talk about that, if you're talking about getting youth out to hunt, really an ideal time to do it. More so the weather is great. Kids aren't real excited to probably go out there and freeze their butts off to kill coyotes like we are. So when you can hunt coyotes in hoodies and T-shirts and you're having some success and some luck calling in coyotes, that's exciting for those kids. When we talk a little bit about the life cycle of coyotes, there's lots of opportunity this time of year, which we're going to get into here just shortly. But, to kind of get you pumped up about that story, it's a great way for us to start our season. But based off of that, let's get into a little bit on early season coyote tactics. So to really understand early season tactics, and when I talk more about late season coyote tactics and stuff throughout this, episodes coming up, I'm going to use this same model. When I'm teaching my coyote schools, things like that, we spend a lot of time talking about this because I think it's extremely important to really understand coyotes. Coyote hunting is basically taking a whole bunch of variables, a whole bunch of theories, and kind of putting them all together and coming up with an educated guess. Every time you pick a sound, it's an educated guess based off of these variables. Every time you pick a spot to call, it's an educated guess based off these variables. So understanding this coyote life cycle is extremely important. So let's talk about that a little bit. We're only getting one crop of coyotes a year, okay? And I talked earlier about self-imposed seasons and some guys, killing coyotes year-round. Ultimately, there's give and take there. If you're killing coyotes all year, either two things have to happen. Either A, you have to have enough properties to hunt where the stuff you're hunting in the summer maybe is not the same stuff you're hunting in the winter. Or if the stuff you're hunting in the winter, you have to hope that there's lots of these, when we're going to talk about this, transient coyotes, young coyotes that will move back into your areas come fall and winter when there's this great dispersal of coyotes. So you can't expect if you're out killing coyotes in the summer that there's always going to be a bunch of coyotes back in the wintertime. But vice versa, if you're only killing coyotes in the fall and winter and, your places that you're hunting, aren't seeing pressure and aren't having coyotes killed off, then we know based off this coyote life cycle that the coyotes themselves are going to replenish the population. And by the time I come back next fall and winter to hunt coyotes, there's going to be new coyotes in there. So when we take a look at this coyote life cycle, let's start when coyotes are born, all right? Coyotes have a gestation period of about 60 days, just like a normal dog, okay? So a lot of coyotes are being born in the month of April, maybe May if it's late. I think, it varies across the country, just like the deer rut and things like that. But it's pretty synonymous with, springtime, fawns being born and things like that. Coyotes are having pups at the same time. So come April, that's when we will have our highest density of coyotes we will have year-round. And when I'm talking about this coyote life cycle, I'm talking about it as a whole, let's say in the entire United States or entire North American province, whatever we're talking about. I'm not talking about a very specific area like a specific ranch or a specific county. I'm talking about generally speaking, okay? So in April, we have all these coyote pups born. So we have our highest density of coyotes. Now, when I talk about this, I talk about the density of coyotes and I talk about density of callable coyotes because there's a big difference. And what we're looking for is densities of callable coyotes. So obviously in April, we have the most coyotes we're going to have all year in April, but a huge portion of those are uncallable because they're little 2-week-old coyote pups still in the den with their eyes closed, right? So what we get then, as the summer progresses, not every coyote is going to mate. These coyote pups that are, a year old, when mating season back in February rolls around, a lot of these pup coyotes are 9-10 months old. Not every one of those is going to breed. So, you might only have the 2-year-old and up population doing a majority of the breeding. So not every coyote's going to breed. Once you get to the summertime, not every coyote is going to have a den of pups. There's still going to be these 1-year-old transient coyotes roaming around, trying to make ends meet as well, not just the pair of coyotes trying to, feed their pups in the den. So as the summer progresses, these coyotes that are adult coyotes that are raising these pups, the pups are getting bigger. Come towards the end of the summer, these coyote pups start coming out of the dens. They're still not callable coyotes at this point. They're just, into that coyote density, not the coyote callable density side. But once we get into summer, start getting into August, September, these coyotes are old enough now that they're going to start dispersing over the next couple months. And I think just like anything, some litters are, born before others. Some coyotes in the litters are just naturally bigger and more aggressive, and they'll head out on their own sooner than other coyotes. But in this fall time now, a huge portion of these coyotes that were uncallable have now become callable coyotes, just because now they're old enough to move on their own. They're trying to feed on their own. They're not relying on mom and dad anymore. And they're dispersing across the countryside now. They're, the parents are kicking them out of their area. Coyotes aren't pack animals like wolves. They have this social dynamic early on throughout the summer in the family groups and things like that. But once the fall hits, the coyotes are going to go back to being kind of solitary animals and wanting to be on their own. So these pups are dispersing across the landscape, and that's why early season coyote hunting really is the best you're probably going to find all year, because now we have our highest density of callable coyotes you're going to have all year, because now if you picture a graph, you have this density of overall coyotes is pretty high right now. Obviously, over the course of the summer, some coyotes are dying off, just maybe getting hit by cars, dying of disease, things like that. And then obviously now once you have all these pups now are big enough, they're starting to disperse. And once you start getting coyotes to disperse, they're going to start getting hit by cars. And that's a good sign early in the fall. If you're traveling a lot and all of a sudden you start to see some coyotes, more coyotes dead on the side of the road, that's telling you that, hey, we're probably getting into this dispersal time frame where these pups now are big enough to start scattering out, which when they're starting to scatter out, that means they're getting big enough to call in. And also early in the fall, the coyotes haven't seen a whole lot of hunting pressure yet. In general, I think there's lots of guys that will hunt coyotes all year and things like that. But in general, I think the hunting pressure is still pretty minimal at this point. So early fall, you have the highest densities of callable coyotes you're going to have all year, and you probably have some of the lowest hunting pressure you're going to have for the next 4 or 5 months. So you put those two in conjunction with each other, and it usually makes the calling pretty good. Now, as the winter progresses, you just have a steady decline in the number of coyotes. Now, big game seasons hit, and we all know if we're out deer hunting, a lot of guys will shoot coyotes and things like that. Then actually coyote hunters are out killing coyotes. So you just have this steady decline from, October all the way through February of not only the overall coyote density, but you have a steady decline then in the overall the callable coyote density as well. Now, usually the callable coyote density will be a little bit steeper drop than the overall angle, because now we're talking about callable coyotes. So now we have to take into consideration the coyotes that maybe have been pressured now, the coyotes that called in that didn't get killed, because now those coyotes are quite a bit smarter, and I tell people, you're going to get one crack at calling in a coyote that time of year. And if you mess it up, that coyote, heck, he might be 10 times smarter the next time you try to come in there and kill him again. So it makes them tougher to get killed. So they're not necessarily callable at that point in some situations. So that line's a little steeper. Now, as we get, through the winter months, you get into, late January, dynamics change a little bit. The coyotes aren't so worried about sustaining themselves anymore. They're more worried about sustaining the coyote population, which is a bonus for us. These coyotes now, they've been pressured. They're switching gears to mating season. So there's some tactics we can use late season when it comes to using more coyote-based sounds, especially the stuff you'll find on a lucky duck call, the coyote fights, the breeding sounds, the coyote vocals, and this is a whole new podcast later this year when we'll talk into late season tactics. And there's things you can do to throw at these remaining coyotes that are left. And at this point, you may be looking at 50% less coyotes in the area than what you had back in October. Just because that's, how many coyotes might be dying off and getting killed out of an area. So, And then obviously now the coyotes are breeding, and it's February, and then 2 months later, we have a whole new crop of coyotes in April, and the whole cycle starts again. So keep that cycle in mind when you're hunting coyotes, and use it as one of these variables that we talk about that we try to alleviate and try to plan for. Now, another thing when it comes to early season coyotes is laying out a plan for the access, the land you have to hunt. Now, laying out a plan is important. We all have access to places that we hunt, ranchers we know, farmers we know, public land that we know, whatever it may be. And hopefully you have some sort of log. Maybe it's just in your memory. Maybe you're using Onyx Hunt. You're marking all your spots. And early on in the season, I will sit down before I start hunting coyotes, and I will kind of lay out a calendar of how many days a month do I think I'm going to be able to hunt coyotes. And at that point, I'm going to use that to determine how much land access am I going to need. I mean, it takes a lot of access to continually and successfully kill coyotes for 4 or 5 months throughout what I call my coyote season, October through, February. And a lot of people underestimate how much access and how much land, it really takes to, consistently kill coyotes like that. So I'll look, and if I say, I'm going to be able to hunt coyotes 15 days a month, okay? And I'm talking about full days of hunting. That means leaving the house, getting out on the stand, first stand of the morning at sunup, and hunting all day until dark, making 15, 18 stands, whatever it may be. At that point, I'll say, okay, if I'm going to hunt coyotes 15 days a month, I'm going to take that times 2. And that's how many days worth of hunting I need access for. So in that case, I need 30 days worth of hunting access. Okay? Now you may be saying, wow, that's incredible. I mean, that's a ton of amount of land to hunt. Well, what I like to do is I like to create a first half and a second half season. And this is an ideal situation. I like to come in and hunt properties one time in the first half of the season and a second time in the second half of the season. All right? Now, that's ideal. Does it happen all the time? No. Sometimes I'll hunt properties 3, 4 different times, sometimes even 5, depending on certain situations and things like that. But, it sounds crazy, but it's more on the coyote management side. Now, there's a lot of different variables involved in that. Some of those places you might not have sole access to. Other people you may be letting it sit for a month and a half, but there may be 10 other guys in there hunting it. And it's all things you got to kind of put into the equation. So, but that'll give you a decent idea of really how much. If you think you're going to hunt coyotes, let's just say you're going to hunt coyotes 10 days a month. So through my equation, you said, okay, I need 20 days worth of access. And you say, man, I only have like 3 places to hunt coyotes. What that should tell you is if you're going to spend 10 days hunting coyotes, but you only have enough days access for 3 days, maybe let's take those other 7 days instead of going and hunting those same 3 spots over and over and over again. Let's spend those 7 days scouting new ground, knocking on doors, getting permission, trying to, line up more access. So now instead of 3, I have maybe 6 or 8. Instead of just going back and hunting the same spot over and over. Now, this is why people do this. It's easy just to go back to the same spot over and over and over and over and over again because you know it. You're familiar with it. The landowner, whatever it is. It's uncomfortable sometimes to go knock on doors and get permission and kind of go out of your comfort zone to find new things. But it's something you have to do. Land access is critical, and it all starts early in the season like this. Now, a second part of this is looking at the properties you have to hunt, and I kind of rank them, whether they're public land, whether they're private land. If they're public land, do I think, are they kind of more off the beaten path, or there's something that probably everybody's going to eventually try to call? When I look at my private ground, is it something that maybe the rancher, maybe it's a family ranch or a personal friend, and maybe they're the only one that lets me out there hunt. Maybe it's a good rancher, and he lets anybody that asks out to hunt. So I'll calculate all that. Now, what happens a lot of times, just from my experience of talking with lots of coyote hunters from all over the country, we all have the itch early in the season to go out and kill coyotes, right? And a lot of times what happens is we're pumped up to go hunting coyotes, so when we have the first chance to go, what do we end up doing? We end up wanting to go to our very best spot. And why is that our very best spot? More than likely, it's probably our best spot because it's either a public place that's maybe way off the beaten path that nobody else has found, or it's a private ranch that maybe a lot of people don't have access to. And they'll go hunt that very first thing out just because they know it's going to be good, and they're excited and they're pumped up, and they'll go hunt that place right off the bat. The problem with that is that place was probably good to save till maybe later in the winter. And maybe if you would have taken a little bit deeper look at, the places you have, maybe the first several hunts of the year, you go and hunt the places that maybe are going to have more pressure, more competition from other hunters, and try to be one of the first couple ones into that area. And it's hard to do because obviously those might not be your best days. You might only kill a coyote or two in those places versus maybe a 5 or 6 coyote day in your other places. So it's hard to do, but it's something, if you want to consistently kill coyotes, for 4 or 5 months, it's something you got to definitely look at and do. So evaluate your properties. And like I said, back to my story of our hunt, this weekend, we hit some public sections, and these sections, I guarantee in another 2 months, probably won't be very good. I mean, they'll have been hunted by multiple other hunters. And Brett has access to lots of landowners down there, and we didn't hit a lot of it. He'll save that for later in the winter, and things like that for possibly a contest or, something else that comes up, maybe when the fur's a little bit better, and worth a little bit more money and things like that. So keep all that in mind, when it comes to lining up properties and assessing your properties and basing early season hunts versus late season hunts. Second part of that, different parts of the country, early season, you have to look at the food sources. What are the coyotes eating early season? What are the coyotes eating in the summer? What are they eating in the fall? Here in our neck of the woods in Nebraska, Colorado, there's lots and lots of food sources for these coyotes. I mean, right now, even in October, there's still the snakes, the lizards. There's water, so they're eating frogs and toads. There's grasshoppers. We have these massive grasshoppers that are like 2 inches tall. We saw some this weekend out hunting. Obviously, then you have all the rodents and the rabbits and all the normal stuff that you might think there. The coyotes will eat cactus blooms and you name it. These coyotes will eat it. So there's just a plethora of food sources for them right now. So, if you go into more arid parts of the West, some of the sage country of Wyoming, Nevada, down in the Southwest, those food sources are limited. They don't have that many options. So, I relate to that. Those coyotes are eating rabbits a primary portion of the year. So the hunting can be a little bit better in those situations earlier in the fall than it can be in maybe our neck of the woods because, they get a little colder quicker. The coyotes are turning gears a little bit more. The pup coyotes and things like that are having to hunt a little bit harder. So, for example, an early season hunt, let's say the end of September, 1st of October, in some of that sage country of Wyoming or Nevada, down in the deserts of, Nevada or Arizona, New Mexico, rabbit-based sounds, you might have some really, really good responses from coyotes, meaning good, hard runs, coyotes coming from long, long ways to eat, where that same time frame in maybe the Midwest and even the East, when the prey species and the amount of food sources are, still abundant, those coyotes aren't going to be as motivated to come from as far and maybe run as hard to the call and things like that. So sometimes it takes a little bit later in the winter, hard freezes for multiple nights, some snow and things like that to really kill off some of these other food sources or get rid of some of these other food sources and really, force these coyotes to start hunting, rodents and rabbits and things like that. And sometimes that's really will be the kicker when the hunting gets good in those areas when you finally get to those points when the conditions change like that. Now, kind of one of the last things I want to talk to you about is early season sounds. When we look back at that coyote life cycle, in October, you're estimating that probably anywhere from 50 to 70% of the callable coyote population that time of year is going to be pup coyotes, meaning these, 5, 6-month-old coyote pups that are dispersing across the country, okay? So when you think about that, these are not very aggressive coyotes. Some of these coyotes have no clue where they're at. They're transient coyotes that are dispersing, trying to find their own little territories. So you really have to be cognizant of that and say, okay, if there's a very good chance that the coyote that's out here on this stand that I'm hoping to call in is one of these young coyotes. I don't want to spook this coyote off playing the wrong type of sound, meaning more of an aggressive bass sound, some sort of coyote howls, maybe like a deep pair howl, maybe some knockdown, drag-out coyote fights, even just a loud rabbit sometimes, a jackrabbit or something could be enough to even spook them off. So when I'm looking at sounds, I'll put them on an aggression scale. And if you look at prey-based sounds, that's your rabbits, your birds, your rodents, there's less aggressive sounds and there's more aggressive sounds. And what I mean by that is some of your more higher-pitched, squeaky, naturally not loud sounds, like your lip squeaks, like your baby cottontail demise, like your rodent squeaks and things like that. Those are the less aggressive. And then, maybe some of your bird sounds, like there's a sound called lucky pecker on the lucky ducks that I use a lot. And it's kind of mid-range, I would say, in the aggression scale. And then you get into the loud rabbits, more aggressive. And like I said, I'll use those loud, more aggressive sounds if there's wind and I just think I need more volume to carry out there a little further. But early on in the season like this, if there's not a lot of wind, I will use those less aggressive sounds a lot. Now, when I'm throwing sounds at them, I'm not going to play prey distress sounds the whole time. I'm going to play prey distress sounds for the first maybe 5 minutes. I may play that squeakier, less aggressive sound for the first 2 or 3 minutes, and that's basically appealing to any coyotes that's maybe out there within 300, 400, 500 yards. Obviously, if a coyote's only that far out there, it's not going to take them very long to get to us if they decide they want to come and investigate the sound. At that point, I may say, you know what, I want a little more volume to carry out across this stand a little bit more, so I may switch to a sound like lucky pecker or TNT cottontail or cotton ball for the next 3 or 4 minutes, just to carry out that. Now that sound's carrying out to maybe 800 to 1,000 yards, and I'll give that a couple more minutes to say, okay, if the coyote hears that and wants to respond to the call, it shouldn't take him just a few minutes to cover that ground and get here. Now, at that point, I'm 6 minutes deep into the stand. I'm going to switch gears. I'm going to say, okay, you know what? We tried to key on this hunger instinct with the prey distress sounds. Now I want to key on more of this social family dynamic that these coyotes have been part of for the last 4 months, meaning these family groups of pup coyotes being raised by the mom and dad. So I'm going to go to pup distress sounds. Huge assortment of those on the Lucky Duck calls. You go into the pup distress folder, you got schoolyard brawl, you got pup chaos, you got pup detention, and these are pup, eyes essentially, pup distress calls. And not only will you key in on, the adult coyotes that maybe think, hey, maybe their pups have just dispersed in the last month, and they may think this is one of their pups in trouble. I don't know exactly what a coyote's thinking. But it triggers something different in the coyotes than what a prey distress sound does. And I'm going to play that because that is a more aggressive sound than your prey distress sound, especially your rabbit or your rodent squeaks and things like that. So I'll elect to play that last. And that's that aggression scale as well, based on the first sound I'll play and the last sound I'll play on a stand. I will do that aggression scale as well. I'll start less aggressive. When I end the stand, I'm as aggressive as I want to be. And that's usually how I'll set up usually stands for this early season. Prey distress sounds for the first half, pup distress, coyote-based sounds for the second half. And depending on the day, early like that, like this example this past weekend, it was 72 degrees, sunny in the middle of the day. At that point, in the middle part of the day, you just know these coyotes aren't willing to travel that far to the call. They're not going to come running from, 1,000 yards or a mile. They're just not going to come that far. So you have to really anticipate that the coyotes you're calling in are coming from, under a half mile, 800 yards and under, and it just doesn't take coyotes that long to cover that distance if they're interested in coming to the call. So I'm not sitting there that long. I'm covering lots of ground, and I'm able to make more stands in a day and, hopefully kill more coyotes. So that's kind of the approach that I take to early season hunting. So once again, it's not always great, You are going to run into some days where, maybe you're just experimenting with some new ground. Maybe you're hunting some of those areas that maybe aren't going to be great. You're saving you're being patient, and you're doing it the right way, and you're saving your good ground for maybe a little bit later in the winter when some of this other stuff gets hammered a little bit harder. But be patient. It's a good time to get out. It's a good time to knock the dust off everything and get ready If you're into the fur market, obviously, the fur isn't quite primed yet when you're shooting coyotes in October, but that's okay. Obviously, like I said, don't go kill off all your coyotes in October, but it's good to go knock the dust off. And so once the fur market picks up in November, you're ready to roll. But that's really about all I wanted to talk about today with early season tactics. Hopefully, you can put some of this to use right now and get out there and get some coyotes killed. I'm going to get into a lot more on these future episodes. I'm actually headed to Idaho here to film the first episodes of Season 4 of The Last Stand here. So I'll be having a podcast coming up shortly on that hunt, heading up to Rusty Gamble and Seth Simpson, Craig Sandy. You might recognize those guys from Instagram and things like that. So that's about all I have. So if you want more information about myself and what I do, you can visit my website at coyotecraze.com. Follow me on Instagram. I'm going to be posting stories. I'm going to be hunting a lot from here on out. So it's at Geoff Nimnick, and that's Geoff. Just search that in the little search engine on Instagram, and you'll be able to find me. I'll be one of the first couple that come up there. So yeah, looking forward to getting going. The season's just getting going. I'm pumped up. Going to be bringing you a lot more great stuff here shortly. So appreciate you tuning in, and we'll catch you next time. Thanks.